Thank you. You can be seated. It is. Thank you for all of the Minyan Chavarim leaders and readers, and I was blessed with a double portion of Marta today because Marta did the Haftarah in the early Minyan as well. So as this morning we celebrated the Lucy and Esther August birthdays, which are celebrated every August. Of course, Esther and Lucy lived well past 100 years old and active in the congregation. And in a bequeath to the congregation, it was that we continue to celebrate their birthdays together each August. And that took place this morning. And there was a nice cake and really just a lovely way for those that knew them. You loved them. So I got to hear Marta twice. The summer sermon series, exactly, I just had to get that going, right? When you marry a librarian, you have to speak like that. Continues, and it is a great pleasure to invite Art Popper to come forward to speak. Art was president of the congregation in 2001 to 2003, which I remember those dates specifically because in 2002, right in the midst, he was the president that made the decision, foolish or not, to hire me as the junior rabbi here, and it brought my connection to Bethel, to Art and Helen, to Bill and Gail, and to the congregation. It began my tenure here at Bethel. Professionally, Art is a professor emeritus at University of Maryland, and his field of study, I know it has a fancy name to it, but what always strikes me is it's the intersection of sound, how man-made sound affects marine life. So I think of like how ocean drilling affects whales. Is that right, Art? See, I listen to you. Right, I listen to you. And it's with great appreciation for Art, what you have brought to the congregation, and to Helen as well, that I invite you to the Bima.
I had a really remarkable experience when I was president. I actually was able to sign a contract with two rabbis, with Bill Rudolph as our senior rabbi, and then hiring this young man, not so young anymore, are you? And if anyone wants, I can tell you stories about his interview, which was the interview before he came here to be interviewed up at the seminary. It was an extraordinary experience we had. That's a whole other story. But one that I treasure and which I think we both look on as a good day. Yeah? Okay, so Shabbat Shalom. And what I want to do today, I'm not going to talk about the Torah portion. We've heard enough. And what I want to talk about is something that's intrigued me for years now, and it actually has a real relevance to the whole Torah. And what I'm hoping to do is get you to think a little differently about yourselves. I don't want you to do that now while I'm talking, but when you go home, or as you don't do it when you're driving either, because it takes some deep thought. Think about it, because what I'm going to talk about actually likely has impacted your lives in a lot of ways, and you may not have ever thought about it. So I'm going to get you thinking about the paths of your lives, and the paths that you've taken, and maybe that you'll be taking. And what I've discovered in thinking about this is that there are coincidences not only in our lives, but also in Torah, and I'll talk about some of those today. I am not going to suggest that the experiences I'm going to talk about for me or in the Torah are the same ones that you have, but the idea that I want to share with you is what I think you'll be thinking about. I want to start by sharing a story about a personal experience. This happened around 1963, I think it was. I was in college, NYU, which was then had a campus in the Bronx, New York, no longer there. But I lived pretty near. I lived in Washington Heights. Now, you've all heard of Washington Heights if you know anything about Lin-Miranda. In the Heights, that musical was written about the neighborhood he grew up in and I grew up in. I'm a little bit older than he. He was not alive when I was there, but we were in the same neighborhood. And he wrote this musical, and that's where I was living. So what I would do on really nice days, since I was living close to NYU, maybe 2 miles away, I would walk to school on a beautiful day. It was good exercise. And one of these days, I happened to walk past a new pet store in town. I'd never seen it before. It was actually down the block from where I lived and across the street from the school my mom was teaching in. And I had time before my first class. So I went into the pet shop and I decided to look at the tropical fish, since that was kind of a hobby of mine. I came to one tank in this pet store and I stopped in my tracks. I really stopped cold because I noticed that the fish were albino. They had no color to them. They were pinkish. And to my real shock, since I'd never seen anything like it before, these fish had no eyes. And that really intrigued me. And I kept thinking about this and I realized that not any vertebrate I've ever heard about had no eyes. The tank label said Mexican blind cavefish, and that these fish live in caves in the Yucatan Peninsula of Mexico. And as I watched them swim around, I noticed a couple of things about them. First, I noticed they never bumped into the walls. They just kept swimming and avoided the walls. I also noticed they never bumped into each other, and there were a lot of fish in the tank. And then finally, I noticed that when somebody put food in the tank, the fish went right to it. There was no hesitation. They knew exactly what they were doing, and they found the food. I vividly recall leaving the pet store and walking up to NYU, and these Mexican blind cavefish were swimming in my head. I just could not get them out of my mind. So the very first thing I did when I got up to the campus was to go to the office of my comparative anatomy professor, a guy named Doug Webster, who later became a good friend, and asked Doug if he knew anything about Mexican blind cavefish. Webster, who actually worked on small mammals, said he'd never heard of them, didn't know anything about them, but he invited me to do research about them in his lab as an undergraduate. That was a profound moment in my life. I accepted immediately, and that actually was the start of my research career that lasted the rest until today. So seeing these blind cavefish got me to do research in Doug's lab. What if I'd not gone to the pet store and didn't see the fish? Or if I just noticed them and passed them to looked at some other tank? The truth is my life today would be very different. Yeah, I wouldn't even be talking to you today. I would not have been involved in hiring Greg Harris. So everything would have been different. And I think that's a fascinating to think about. Several months after that, I was doing undergraduate research in Doug's lab, and he decided to introduce me to a guy named Don Eric Rosen. Don was the head of fish department, ichthyology, at the American Museum of Natural History. And much to my delight, Rosen offered me a part-time job working in the museum with the amazing collection they have of fishes from around the world, preserved fishes, I should say. As an aside, this was a dream job for me because since I was about 10 or 11 years old, virtually every weekend I'd spend time at the museum. I loved the place, and I still do. And I wandered the halls, never thinking I'd wind up working behind the hall doors. It was great. Okay, so one day, several months later, I was in my little laboratory behind the geology exhibit, and I was working on a thing called a parrotfish. And in comes Dr. C. Levette Smith. You've never heard of Smitty, but he was another faculty member in the fish department. And he decided he wanted to look at this parrotfish I was interested in, I was working with, and he started dissecting it. He was really good, and he was a great teacher. And he showed me his little tiny bones in the head called otoliths. Never heard of them before. You probably have never heard of them. But they're the ear bones of fishes. And you actually have similar things in your ears. They're not bones, they're crystals, but it's the same structure. It's involved in balance, and in fishes, it's involved in hearing. That's I can talk about that one for hours. I remembered being fascinated by these bones for some reason, and ultimately, as I've already implied, they became part of my career. And I've been working on them. In fact, yesterday afternoon, I was writing about them to somebody. Being in the ichthyology, the fish department of the American Museum gave me other opportunities to meet people. And one day I happened to meet a guy named William Tavalga. And he was in the Department of Animal Behavior at the museum. And he invited me to come to his lab. I started to learn about him. And I asked him if I could do doctoral research with him. And he accepted me. Well, Bill was the world's authority on the use of sound by marine animals. And he was specifically studying hearing by fishes. My doctoral research project became hearing. And as you probably can guess, my subject were Mexican blind cavefish. So those blind cavefish have been with me for a long time. In fact, my whole career wound up being on hearing and fish and aquatic life. And it's been, I think, an extraordinary career. I've taught at major universities. I've published lots of books and scholarly papers. I've been involved in research around the world. And I've got to meet and know and become friends with really amazing people. Helen and I can go almost any place in the world, and we inevitably find someone I've collaborated with, I've worked with, and who become friends. So it's a pretty cool experience to be able to go to Prudhoe Bay, Alaska, and find somebody I was interested in, I knew. Pretty cool. So my point is, I'm sure you realize, if I had not encountered those blind cavefish, my life today would be totally different. And most importantly, the blind cavefish led me to meeting a young woman at City College one day. I actually kicked her out of my office because she annoyed me, Helen Appel. And we've been married for almost 57 years. So it's a whole other story there, but those fish led me to Helen. What more could I ask in life, you know? So the point of the long introduction is to introduce you to the idea of serendipity. It's a word I've come to love very much. Serendipity is basically defined as an unplanned, fortunate occurrence that may alter one's life path, often in very gigantic ways. Certainly in my case, if I had not gone to that pet store, or I'd not been mesmerized by blind cavefish, or I'd not met Helen, my life today would be totally different. And as I said earlier, I wouldn't be here today probably. Indeed, once I got interested in the concept of serendipity, I realized that there were many inflection points in my life where recognizing something and acting upon it changed my life course. But I'm far from unique. I trust that everyone here today, even if you do not realize it, has experienced serendipity in their lives. But don't stop to think about that now, please, because that'll take you off into thinking about your lives. Listen to me, and then later on you can do that. But it really, I am quite convinced that we all experience, and it's a good thing. It just changes the way we go in life. But I thought about what happens if I hadn't had those serendipitous events? Where would I be? What would I be doing? And I realized that it's not something to think about, that I'm truly content with my life is gone, and those events have just shaped it. And I think that's the case, hopefully, for all of us. So when I was asked by Rabbi Megdal when she was looking for people to do Devar Torahs this summer, I thought about serendipity, and I started to wonder whether serendipity appears in Jewish life and in the Torah. I thank Rabbi Megdal for her super support and her encouragement and advice that I prepared this Devar Torah. She gave me great feedback and was most encouraging, and I'm truly grateful to her. So being a reasonably modern senior, not as modern as my grandkids, what did I do? But I turned to Google and to ChatGPT and a few other things like that, artificial intelligence, and asked about serendipity in the Bible, and particularly in the Torah. Well, what I learned right away is that the serendipity word never appears in the Bible. In fact, I discovered that the word never appeared in the English language until 1754 by a writer named Horace Walpole. So serendipity doesn't appear, but the concept of serendipity is there. Second, I learned that there are many things in Torah that can be viewed as being serendipitous. And the third, the questions arise as to whether these events are truly serendipitous or whether they happen because of God's intervention. Indeed, and think about the Bible, one can consider that serendipity implies a kind of grace, an unexpected but welcome outcome, not entirely of one's own making, clearly with interaction with God. That's why what I also learned was that the phenomenon of serendipity, or the concept of serendipity, can be thought of as divine orchestration behind events, coincidences that shift lives, hidden blessings within apparent detours, something that is deeply embedded in the biblical narrative. Or put it simply, God is using serendipitous events to help shape our lives. So let's look at some biblical events and think about divine orchestration that resulted in what we are in the 21st century, what we today might think of as serendipitous. So one story that can certainly be considered serendipitous with God's intervention, a story we all know, is Moses walking in the Egyptian desert and happening to notice a burning bush. You're all familiar with that story, right? Well, presumably Moses could have just walked on, perhaps thinking the cause was lightning or a lightning bolt or something else, or not even thinking about it at all. But instead, Moses noticed the bush, and then the Torah says, when God saw that he had turned aside to look, God called to him out of the bush, "Moses, Moses." Moses answered, "Here I am." And you know what that led to. So I think we can all agree that this serendipitous discovery by Moses totally changed the course of Jewish and indeed Western history. Of course, it is possible or even likely that God, by calling out, ensured that Moses would stop and think. But we don't know that. So perhaps we can call this moment, this monumental moment, serendipity, even with God's intervention. But there are other Moses stories that are involved that we can think about as serendipitous. Think about the very well-known incident in Exodus where infant Moses is hidden in the basket on the Nile. We learn, and his sister stood afar to see what would be done to him. And the daughter of Pharaoh came down to bathe in the river, and she saw the ark and the flags, and she had compassion on him. You know that story. Here's a series of coincidences, some of which we might view as serendipitous. The sister watching from afar, Pharaoh's daughter appearing in that precise moment, her maiden spotting the basket, resulting in Moses' life being spared and placed in Egypt's palace. What looked random is portrayed as divine orchestration. God arranged the right people at the right time would be there, and he also arranged for those involved to not only see, but most importantly, to think about what they were seeing and act upon it. Then in Genesis, we learn about another major inflection point in our history. In this case, Jacob arrives in Haran, tired and alone. By the well, he suddenly sees a beautiful young woman, Laban's daughter Rachel, arriving with her flock. We read, "Rachel came with her father's sheep, and it came to pass, when Jacob saw Rachel, Jacob went near and rolled the stone from the well's mouth and watered the flock." At first glance, it's a chance meeting, but it changes Jacob's life since, as we all know, he marries Rachel and builds his family. In retrospect, one sees God's hand. The man who prayed for a wife was led exactly to that place and time. Was Jacob seeing and reaching to the side of Rachel serendipity? We don't know. And it goes on. In Genesis, Abraham's servant stands by a well, praying for a sign that the woman who offers him water and water for his camels is Isaac's destined wife. We read, "And it came to pass before he had done speaking in his heart, behold, Rebekah came forth, and with her pitcher upon her shoulder. As soon as he finishes prayer, the right woman appears." This immediate answer to the heartfelt prayer is a classic example where the coincidence of Rebekah's timely arrival is shown as God's direct response to his faith. Each of these stories shows a small or chance that leads to a major turn in the destiny of God's people. The narrative invites us to read these as signs of God's care beyond the scenes. Indeed, each of these events can also be seen as serendipitous. How would our history have been different if someone had not focused on what we observed and acted upon it? And in each case, one can envision that the setup of the event and the reaction of those involved was a result of God's intervention. Yet still, in terms we know, each was a case of serendipity. Each of you could probably find other examples in the Torah, so I won't go on giving these to you. We all want to go and have something to eat. But since we all want to go to this, let me just end with a few final remarks. In modern language, serendipity refers to the occurrence of fortunate discoveries made by accident. The term implies a kind of grace, an unexpected but welcome and perhaps life-changing outcome, not entirely of one's own making, other than that if one was not aware, one would have missed it. And while the word serendipity is less than 400 years old, the concept of serendipity is ancient. While the word does not appear in the Jewish Bible, the phenomenon of serendipity, even if his divine orchestration behind events serves as coincidence that shift lives, it's deeply embedded in the narrative. Indeed, this is particularly true in Torah, where many key events in Jewish sacred history emerge from what appeared on the surface to be accidents of fate, only later to be revealed as divine design. So I hope I've helped you realize serendipity is very much part of our lives, just as it's been part of the Bible and Torah. And it is reasonable to add the idea that divine intervention may well be behind each serendipitous event. My goal today has been to share the idea of serendipity in my life as well as in the Torah. While I have no expectation that my specific words will have impact on your lives, perhaps you will still think about serendipity and how it has shaped your lives and how the lives of your loved ones, perhaps listening to me. In fact, perhaps listening to me, if you think about it, could be a serendipitous moment in somebody's life. Thanks very much, and Shabbat Shalom.